Praise the Lord. We're going to read Genesis chapter uh, 19, 1 to 9. And the title of this is Lot in his mindset went to extreme measures to protect the quote unquote men. And it says, And there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, Behold now, my lords, I turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early and go on your ways. And they said, Nay, but we will abide in the street all night. And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house. And he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have two daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. And they said, Stand back. And they said again, This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs to be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Again, reading verse number 1, it says, And there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gates of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. The two angels that were with the Lord talking to Abraham had finally come to Sodom, while God and Abraham were discussing about Sodom. The action does not seem to turn towards Gomorrah, but that city, of course, was involved in the crimes against humanity of homosexuality. Though there was no law that was placed upon the earth, it was God using the conscience of the people. But the people back then did not hearken to their consciences. And one can compare that time period to the time period of Noah as well. They wouldn't hearken at all to their consciences. Lot, it says, was sitting in the gate of Sodom. So therefore he saw these men come. The details do not emerge about why Lot was sitting there in the gate, but it was the right timing when the angels had come, for Lot was there. And it was almost like it was prepared by God to have them meet at the gate of Sodom. When Lot had seen the angels, there was a positive reaction. But one again does not know if Lot knew that those two were angels. In fact, it would seem like he did not know that at all. He might have felt that they were just needing his help to have them come into his house to take care of their necessities and feed them, and so on and so forth. The angels, of course, appeared to him and to others in form of men. They did not have the glory attached to them, they just appeared as though they were regular men. The men of the city had viewed the angels with a different lens, so to speak, for their purpose was different from that of Lot. Lot wanted to take care of them as like a stranger, or as if they were, and they were, according to Lot, because they didn't. Lot did not know them, so they took Lot took care of them and wanted to treat them well, gentlemanly, respectfully, and so on and so forth. However, the men of the city had an opposite viewpoint. They were just out there to have a sexual relationship by force and lead that and have Lot um, comply with their directions. So Lot led them to his home to have dinner and have them be comforted. Lot had immediately risen up to greet them, but what is interesting is instead of greeting them like other men, he had bowed to them. So that was a respectful gesture. Of course, one notes that mankind is not to worship angels, so one wonders why Lot was bowing to them to the ground with his head to the ground. But it seems like his bow was instead a form of greeting, and it was not in essence a way to worship them. The idea is that Lot had bowed himself with the face to the ground, which means certainly it is a type in our minds a type of worship, but in his mind it was just a form of respect. In Genesis chapter 23 and verse number 7, it says, "And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth." That was in no way in contrast to Abraham's covenant with God. He was just doing so, bowing himself to the people as a form of respect and not a form of worship. So this is another case. Abraham, in that form of respect to the land, to the people of the land, the children of Heth, because he was dealing with them and he had to show them respect and be gentlemen. He did not want to worship them, nor did he think that he was worshiping them as when he was bowing. It was just a form of respect. With Lot bowing at that time, that also seems like it was a form of respect during those time periods. And um, those men that had come to him, he didn't really know who they were, but he must have felt that it was his responsibility. And maybe he sat in the gate because he was a respectable person in that society, and then that is kind of the thing that he would do. He might not have noticed that they were angels, of course, because God had put, we could say, a blindness over his eyes so that he did not know. But it seems strange that he would be able to tell right away. They're appearing not as angels, but they're appearing as men. Verse number 2, it says, "And he said, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early, and go on your ways. And they said, Nay, but we will abide in the street all night." Here is an offer from Lot to these quote unquote men or angels, who Lot probably think that they are travelers. However, what may be strange is the fact that these angels are not carrying anything. I would assume that they're not carrying backpacks, they're not carrying anything on them, they're not with animals, they are just walking. They are solely walking. Why in the mind of Lot would he um, not have been thinking, don't these travelers, if they were, have any kind of bags or other items for carrying? Something should have come up into the mind of Lot, like, why are these strangers without any kind of things for carrying? Where are their items for drinking? Where are their items for eating? When one takes a look at these strangers per se, one notices some discrepancies right away, it would seem. And so we might kind of look at them with a different kind of eye today because we would say, Well, what are these men doing here? These men are not prepared for long distance travel, or they didn't seem like it at least. And those others may have been, because maybe they weren't carrying anything, don't have animals with them, and are out there seemingly just alone. Yet, Lot may not be thinking anything regarding what they have or what they do not have. He just seems to want to help. He might just be thinking of what he could do to offer these travelers and treat them respectfully and gentlemanly as a stranger to a stranger. They seem to be quite different from other travelers because they are possibly more respectful, more courteous, and of course they're righteous, whereas those in Sodom would not be so inclined to be respectful, to be courteous and kind. Travelers must have learned, though, that Sodom was not a place for them to abide the night. For travelers would get raped, even men, and that caused a lot of hardship in the area, and that's why the news arrived in heaven. Therefore, all travelers stayed clear of Sodom, but these two men, they didn't have that quote unquote news. But of course, we know that there are angels and they're not regular men. Lot may have heard of the ordeals in that particular city, and yet one wonders why, with all this news and bad news and wicked news, why is he still there? But he quickly offers these so called travelers some refuge in his own home, probably thinking that nothing would happen to them, especially at his home. He might have thought, well, if he's out there out in the street, well then things are going to happen. But in his home, maybe not. And he was probably sure of it that nothing would happen. Lot might have known also the risk of staying out all night in the street, for that was a dangerous place in Sodom. Therefore, those men who seemed to be quite good men, they should have had a place to abide, and Lot quickly offered it to them. Yet Lot does really not know what they are there for. Lot even mentioned the fact that they could go on their way in the morning. In fact, if you look at that which Lot says, he says it in an almost pleading way. Of course, asking them in a nice way to stay with him, and that would be, of course, with his family too. Lot does not mention about the comfort of his home, nor do we really know about the comfort in Lot's home and what he had had. But he did offer them a place to sleep that night, to wash their feet, and he is probably thinking what could be offered to them for dinner, and so on and so forth. But he doesn't mention dinner at the beginning. Nevertheless, the men at first said that they would like to stay, or they prefer to stay in the street all night long. Maybe it's kind of like if he's going to press us, then that means that he knows, basically knows that something's going to happen, and he really doesn't want that to happen to them. And it was not good for them, so we could also say it wouldn't be common courtesy, it wouldn't be something that would be allowable in lots of eyes because he probably knew what was going to happen or had heard about it. So he wanted to urge them not to stay in the street all night long, but to come and abide with him and his family. And that would, quote unquote, save them from the acts that he probably had heard about. Verse 3 says, And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house. And he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. For us, it would seem like we would be very standoffish, shall we say, in meeting strangers and doing this kind of thing for them. But not in that time. One notices the time of day that these angels had come to the city. It was, in verse number 1, eventime, which means it was evening. In verse 3, Lot, quote unquote, pressed upon them greatly. That is, he asked them nicely, instead stated that they should in no way stay in the street all night, but it was oppressing, meaning that he was trying to get them, in one way or another, convince them to stay with him. He probably would have liked the company a lot too, and he really thought these men were very nice and gentlemen, and they needed a place to stay. So he did not just ask once, but he seemed to really want them to come into his home, so he stated again and again, and until they changed their mind and said, well, okay, we'll stay with you. After such an urging from Lot, they had finally agreed to it. Therefore, it states that they had truly entered into his house. And the fact that Lot had really made them a feast. When it states that Lot had made them a feast, it was like Lot was really preparing well for his guests. It wasn't like that they were going to get just a piece of bread and a little water. Lot did not just give them a couple of things, but they were given enough, in fact, in abundance, insomuch that they were able to enjoy their meal together. Lot really did take care of their stay by means of food and making sure that they had been provided for. The feast was not just unleavened bread, but a feast means that they had plenty to eat. Yet the bread may have been somewhat the main portion of the meal. One does not know by that time whether Lot still had a lot of his flocks and herds. One questions what had happened to them and whether they had been affected before by the war that Sodom and Gomorrah had fought. Earlier, that is the whole reason why Lot and Abraham had separated was due to the amount of flocks that they both had. Furthermore, they each had servants. However, when the angels came to Sodom, nothing is mentioned about Lot's servants, nor about his flocks. He was found not in a tent facing Sodom, but his actual house was in Sodom. Did he move to Sodom because he had lost his flocks and servants? Furthermore, when the angels had asked him if he had anyone else there, he had only gone to those who were to be his quote unquote sons in laws. He did not go to any of his servants. That gives us the indication that he really did not have what he used to have. For he probably would have told his servants about the situation, and he did not have to because they were not there. What had happened? Why is it that Lot seemed like he had lost a lot? None of the flocks are mentioned even when Lot leaves Sodom, nor the men who had previously worked for Lot as servants. It just seems unreal that he might have lost a lot being close to or even having moved to Sodom. He invited them to his home. He had not moved into Sodom. Then the angels would not have needed to go to Lot in Sodom, for he would not have lived there. However, God may have destroyed Sodom anyhow. It just seems, though, that Lot being there fulfilled what God had wanted to do. That is, warn future generations against, if they would, of course, at all listen to him. Sometimes people can get themselves into quite a predicament. Are they getting themselves involved in Sodom more and more until finally they have to be rescued? The angels had told Lot to leave Sodom, and he did. But had he not moved there, they would not have had to tell him to get out of there. He lost everything within the city, even so, and even ultimately, and more shockingly, his wife. His wife was the one that was left, or we would say left behind, but actually it was her decision. Verse number 4 says, "But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter." To such an extent, the city was given over to homosexuality. It was almost bedtime for the visitors and for those of Lot's household. However, before they enjoyed a time of rest, which would have been not have been necessary for them, obviously, because, they were angels. But before they had begun to lay down, there came people from the city, all over the city, men, to try and get what they had wanted, and that, of course, was due to lust. That is, they must have spread the news of the two men who had come to the house of Lot, and everyone must have known exactly where Lot had lived. It's amazing that Lot in his time in Sodom was not sodomized, as we say. However, there were plans from the multitude to sodomize Lot's visitors. Who had spread the news? No doubt it seemed to be everyone with lust, and that seemed to be the entire city. It seemed to not matter what age the male population was. They all wanted, in some way, to participate in that great, grotesque violation of men within their city's limits. A great problem for the city and for any and all travelers that might have come to the city to visit. And it states that all the people, quote unquote, all the people from every quarter, unquote, came to this house. It is interesting that they would see what they could do to rape those men, mistreat them all night long, try to feast their eyes on their wickedness being done. That is what the Lord God of heaven thought that was an abomination. But words really cannot describe the awfulness of their iniquities. It would not have been done, of course, with their permission, but they were doing so by force. In other words, they were forcing men to be raped by men, and that is what most likely heaven had heard about as these angels that were investigating their crimes and really were there for the purpose of delivering Lot and those who would come with him out of the city. It was a city that one desperately needed to leave, most definitely. We can read verse number 5, and it says, "And they called unto Lot and said unto him, Where are the men which came in to thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them." This, of course, is said by the multitude that came to Lot's house, and that they were looking for the quote unquote men. It was not in the mind of the men of the city to have Lot's agreement, or the men inside his home, his agreement either, their agreement. It was in the mind of the men of the city of Sodom to force Lot and the men to comply with their demands. Not only was that, of course, a sin, a really grievous sin, but it's forcing others to do a contrary to the will of God. Their thoughts, of course, were extremely corrupt, that were they were not only affecting their own lives, but the lives of their children, the lives of others, making everyone head down a path of destruction of their own souls and the souls that they had violated. Thus, they were at the door, knocking, probably profoundly and desperately, according to their mindset, commanding Lot to bring the men out. The men did not come to the door. Only Lot did at first. They did not ask Lot, but they had commanded Lot to bring the men out so that they could, essentially, rape them. Of course, that is not gentlemanly conduct, but it is conduct of extremely evil and wicked, extremely wicked human beings. Words cannot even describe the horrifying plans, the ideas, and thoughts of the men of the entire city. But what is even worse, they had all planned to come out as a unit, a unified body to do horrendously wicked acts against, shall we say, God's people. But unbeknownst to them, those two were actually angels. Lot still may not have known it, though, but he was trying his best to protect them in what he could, and at his age of frailty, that might not have been enough, but he was not willing to allow them to do what they were planning to do in their wickedness. In verse number 6 it says, And Lot went out at the door unto them and shut the door after him. First of all, Lot did not even want the men inside to hear the intents of the crowd outside. So he shut the door. However, really, one can think that he did not want the words of the crowd to bother his family either, nor the men who had come under his roof. What is further interesting, too, is that Lot stuck his neck out, form of speaking, for those two strangers, as though they were part of his own family or part of his own life. He felt an obligation to protect them, did the righteous thing by doing all he could with his own power and will to stop them, trying to convince them not to do so, even offering in a kind of compromise to have them avoid doing it in their wicked way. In reading verse number 7 and 8, it says, And said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have two daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray thee, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. Of course, today we are appalled even at the suggestion that Lot would offer his two daughters for the men that had come into his home. They would leave the next day in his thoughts, and if the crowd had accepted the offer, he would essentially be without two daughters, for they would be violated, and his sons in law also would not be able to marry them, or they wouldn't do so due to the violation of the daughters, which meant essentially that Lot would not enjoy any descendants of his. Therefore, in seeing this, the angels then stepped in, meaning that they themselves would also protect Lot and his family from the wicked rioters that had come to humiliate and humble that family. So Lot is sticking out his neck, per se, for those strangers. In verse number 9 it says, And they said, Stand back. And they said again, This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Lot did everything within his power to stop the multitude of wicked men from coming into his home. The crowd threatened Lot, did not listen to his suggestion. Actually, thankfully, they didn't. But they were there adamant. But those wicked men were very adamant to get what they wanted. So they got closer. Lot obviously felt pressure, really had no alternative in his mind, but he was at the end of his rope and he could do nothing, so to speak. And that is when God stepped in to help and deliver him because he had in all his power that he could do protected the angels, though he knew not, of course, that they were angels. The crowd was going to go to extreme measures to find their so-called prize, to violate the men that had come into Lot's house. But they would later find out with whom they were actually dealing with. That is Genesis 19, 1 to 9. May God bless you today in Jesus' name. Amen.